There's been much talk about the need for a change in the international world order that many describe as currently being led by Western unilateralism, leaving developing nations subject to their wealthier counterparts. Much hope has been put in the emergence and the expansion of the BRICS grouping. But the question is, can this collective deliver that much desired change? Journalist Abby Makoe recently wrote a piece suggesting that for BRICS to dare is to do. I caught up with him and he explained what he meant. Abby Makoe, thank you so much indeed for joining us on the BRICS Africa Channel.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for having me.
Abby, you wrote an article recently which was headed, BRICS must learn very quickly that to dare is to do. Talk us through that. What were you thinking? What does that mean?
It's my observation about the rapidly changing geopolitical situation in the world and who the players are. And I'm looking at the dominance of the West in the international agenda setting, the narrative determination, and I take two instances. One, the Ukraine war, just over 2 years ago. Two, 6 months ago, the conflict in Gaza. You look at the narratives and you begin, even if you are the most biased and self-centered person, you begin to see the blatant double standards of the domineering Western powers, and you can see the role of the international media in the debate. My question here is, if the West, take for an example, just after the example about Iran retaliating against an attack by Israel on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Iran goes to the United Nations, 3 permanent members of the Security Council, America, the UK, and France. They refuse to condemn what is clearly an aberration and a contravention of the Geneva Convention by Israel's attack on another country's diplomatic mission, regardless of where that mission is situated. So 13 days later, Iran is saying, well, I tried to go the correct route, so I think it's been left on my own. So I'm making my own decision. I will deal bilaterally with the aggressor. So Iran launches an attack 13 years later. Within 24 hours, the G7 has condemned Iranians' actions, retaliatory actions. 2, they are also taking a decision to impose a new batch of economic sanctions on Iran for retaliating against the aggressor. 3, the role of the media in geopolitics. Only less than 10% of the Western media makes no reference to the fact that Iran was retaliating against Israel. So Iran is made out to be the aggressor, the pariah that it is in the eyes of most Western capitalists. And this is the kind of a narrative that worries me from Afrocentric standpoint. My question here is, we have the emergence of BRICS and BRICS Plus since the last South Africa held heads of state summit of BRICS in South Africa. Now, you wonder, what is the role of BRICS then in geopolitics? If BRICS is regarded as such an important strategic bloc, but every time there are issues of global concern, the silence of BRICS is deafening, almost on every development.
Do the BRICS nations actually have a single voice? You mentioned Ukraine, and I can tell you, I was fascinated to see how Africa was divided over that issue.
In the article that I wrote, I make mention of a number of examples of a post-Ukraine war bilateral relations among the BRICS nations with Moscow. One, India increased its military purchase from Russia despite the sanctions imposed by the West. Now, two, China has been very open about their bilateral relations with Moscow. They've hidden nothing. And they've actually described their relations with Russia as open-ended. Three, South Africa has gone on record to say Pretoria is non-aligned. And therefore, they will speak with both Moscow and Kiev with the intention of brokering a truce between the two. A very commendable approach by South Africa anyway. As for Brazil, the country since Lula came to power again has been consistently very pro-majority world, which is the African, which is the global South. Now, if all the BRICS countries that I mentioned have no regard for the Western imposed economic sanctions on Russia, how come having a so-called strategic bloc of their own are unable to speak in one voice?
All right, so maybe the question then becomes, does BRICS need to formalize itself? Because at the moment, it's not really a formal body. Yes, there's the BRICS Bank. Yes, there are certain initiatives in place, but there isn't a constitution that binds these countries together, that brings each country together in a way that obligates them to perhaps take a position.
The same set of circumstances applies to G7. Exactly the same. No constitution, no obligation. However, all the G7 members are clear on one thing. They have borrowed the Article 41 of NATO. An attack on one is an attack on all. They may not say so as publicly and audibly, but by their actions shall ye judge them. And you can see that in every situation of international development, the G7 assume common posture. America, for an example, just 2 weeks ago, President of the US, Joe Biden, said about Iran, I'm imposing sanctions and I'm expecting the allies of Washington to follow suit. And true to his word, hardly 24 hours, the allies were mimicking the US foreign policy. Which brings me to, over a long period of time, when you analyze the foreign policy of the US allies, from the EU, NATO, to individual other countries such as Canada and the UK, I argue that their foreign policy on analysis, on geopolitical analysis, I can argue that it is based on the principle of monkey see, monkey do. Because once Washington takes a direction, no one will act against Washington's posture.
So what does BRICS do to turn around this Western dominance?
In basic marketing strategy 101, they say in order for you to become successful at what you market, you must first do a thorough study of your opposition of the opponent in order for you to formulate a meaningful and effective strategy that will overwhelm and defeat them. So what BRICS needs to do, BRICS must do exactly what they have done in privacy, to come together away from the media attention and said to themselves and to each other, we must build ourselves into an emerging strategic bloc that will counter the threats posed by the Western hegemony led by Washington, so that our survival depends on our unity of purpose. G7 does not agree on everything. The EU members do not agree on every stance. However, once the majority have undertaken a resolution, it binds everybody, even in G7. So you can argue that India, to a certain extent, is somewhat ideologically dislocated from the rest of the BRICS members. However, it remains an integral member of BRICS. So there should not be a concern as to BRICS adoption of public posture on any development in geopolitics. There is no excuse whatsoever for BRICS to have been quiet on the issue, on the question of Palestine, quiet on the question of Ukraine, when their members are involved directly, when sanctions are imposed against their own members, and quietly and publicly they do not support those sanctions, and they continue to do business with those members who have been sanctioned by the US and the West. So I'm saying, for their communications purposes, BRICS must begin to learn that every successful organization has at the core of its operations effective communications. And BRICS is failing dismally when it comes to that.
Abby Makoe, I wish we could talk for longer. I look forward to future conversations with you. But thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us today on this matter.
You're welcome, Peter. Thank you for having me again. I hope to be back again soon.